Hello everybody and welcome to Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. I'm Jack and today I'm here with Joe, and as you can see we're going to be talking about Worlds today. Worlds is, I think it's pretty much a month away today as of when we're recording this, so not long to go. And now we've had official confirmation about Karen, which we'll get onto a little bit later. We can really delve into the Worlds metagame here and think about what is going to be good leading into this year's World Championships. So yeah, we're going to jump straight into it.
Yeah, so probably the best way is to look back at US Nationals. It was obviously a huge tournament, and it's one of the most recent ones that we have. And like Jack was saying, Karen is not legal, so it's pretty much the best thing we have to go off of in terms of the metagame we have to expect for Worlds. So first of all, we'll look at the final standings. The top 8, there was Nick Robinson, who won with his Night March Vespiquen deck. Seismitoad Giratina also made a surprise appearance, really. Everyone had been, well, no one really had been hyping it. It had been on the down low for a while now, but it really did pull out, a very impressive record, and Marcus got to the finals with it. Also, Waterbox did well. Darkrai Giratina, without the Garbodor, did very well, came 3rd, 4th. There was also another Night March, 2 Trevenant decks, and a Vespiquen Vileplume, so no real surprises from the top 8, other than that Seismitoad Giratina, very consistent decks that we've been seeing at the top tables for a while. Interesting to see that Darkrai Giratina functions so well without the Garbodor in the list. Kind of a cheeky play. You can see the Dragons paid off big time, and yeah, he was able to evade the sort of ability-focused decks because there was already so much fear for ability-focused decks because Garbodor was hyped going into US Nats, so Liam taking the risk, going for a more straight build, really paid off for him.
Yeah, I think that did really well. So then, once we had all of those results from US Nationals, the Charizard Lounge, another sort of independent group of people, or a couple of people that are actually from America, they sort of did a power rankings of pretty much everything that's good in Standard at the moment. So this is directly from their website, so if you want to go and see some of their decisions, you can go and check that out a little bit later on. But yeah, this is like the list of where decks are in terms of kind of a tier list at the moment. So yeah, this is kind of what we're going to be basing our discussion off today. There's things change with Steam Siege, but this was sort of our baseline going into this. We will talk a little bit more about this in a second, but we just wanted to let you know where our starting point was, really.
Okay, so the big discussion point and the thing that we've been waiting for so many weeks now. I can't believe it's taken Pokemon this long to get confirmation out there, but we finally have it. Karen is not legal for Worlds. So, I think it's a sigh of relief for a lot of players who aren't very comfortable going into a whole brand new metagame with maybe just a few weeks to get prepared for. Now we can kind of have a sigh of relief knowing what decks are already quite strong. At the same time, there's always the flip side of that people may be frustrated that Karen wasn't printed because we've seen how dominant Night March has been. I think it was something like 34% of the meta share in the top 64 for US Nats. So dominant. People were praying for Karen if they're someone who's against Night March. And also, I guess to an extent, Vespiquen Vileplume. But those decks aren't going to be hindered. Karen is not legal for Worlds. So very important starting point, really, to discuss.
Yeah, this was like the final little bit of information we needed before we could properly start testing for Worlds. There's some people that have been trying to test a little bit of both formats just in case she was released. But now we have confirmation. It at least puts a lot of people's minds at rest, and like you say, we can now properly get into Worlds testing. Despite it only being a month away, at least we have got a month to at least try and work out what the play is. Okay, so of course the other big bit of news which kind of related to Karen was the fact that Steam Siege is going to be legal for the first time ever in this sort of way. For the first time ever, we're going to have the August set release actually be legal for the World Championships, which kind of took everyone by surprise. I don't think anyone was expecting this at all, really. So yeah, there are going to be some sort of introductions from Steam Siege. That being said, there's nothing that really. Karen was the big kind of shake-up card from Steam Siege, or that people were expecting to be in Steam Siege. So there's nothing that is sort of groundbreaking, but that doesn't mean there's only a handful of decks that aren't affected by in some way at least with this new X and Y set. So we've got a few cards on the screen at the moment. There's a few Pokemon on the left, and then a couple of influential trainers on the right. As we go through, they'll be sort of talked about regarding the different decks and that power rankings we had. But yeah, these are some new cards that we will be mentioning throughout the video, at least.
So there's also one extra curveball that we have to consider when looking at Worlds, and that's this promo Shaymin EX that we're getting from the Elite Trainer box from Generations. Do bear in mind that if you're playing the setup Shaymin EX, this does conflict because they have the same name, so you can't play loads of this guy, but it could be a one-of you could consider if your list is struggling against the likes of Trevenant BREAK, because its ability, Aroma of Gratitude, once during a turn you may heal 20 damage from each of your benched basic Pokemon. That can pretty much insta-win you the game. If you're able to search out, of course, this card, maybe the likes of a Hooper EX if you're playing a heavy EX build, you're really not scared about one damage counter being placed around your board every turn because effectively you're getting that heal. So really, really a nice tech if you are super paranoid about Trevenant. Not sure if people are actually going to put this card in their lists, but I think it's definitely an option and a reason to be worried if you are a Trevenant player.
Yeah, I think it's the only real. It's probably the most influential card from Generations, bar one or two maybe, that we don't already know about or haven't already seen. It's because this has only just technically been released. But yeah, it's definitely something to consider if you're going in thinking about Trevenant BREAK. There is potentially a new contender from or within Shaymin. It's not a hard counter, but it can really slow the deck down to the point where you just can't win in time. So yeah, definitely one to keep an eye out when testing.
Okay, so now we've got the power rankings, the initial power rankings from the Charizard Lounge. Once again, description, look there for the website details. So there's the power rankings. The potential new entries, really, we don't think there's going to be too many new decks coming out, just out of the blue. We sort of have question marks over Volcanion and Yanmega, where they're going to really fit into the game. We're not too sure right now, but we will be discussing them. Also, it's really interesting that the METALBOX deck, despite winning a Nationals not too long ago, it didn't perform well at all at US Nationals. So we also think it's a deck worth noting. This pretty much gives us a broad scope of plenty of decks that you guys have to consider for Worlds. It's really, there's a whole bunch of different options out there. And yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what people actually do go for and, where they land after these sort of initial changes and what cards go up and down based on the introductions from Steam Siege.
Yeah, definitely. I think Steam Siege is more of a set where we're not introducing too many actual archetypes. It's more just potentially influential cards. And you'll see that as we go through the different decks that we're going to talk about. There's one or two cards that keep popping up. But so yeah, don't expect loads of new archetypes and decks, things like that. It's more how a couple of cards actually kind of shake up the format a little bit in themselves. So yeah. So we are, of course, starting with Night March. It was the top of the power rankings, like Joe said, around 34% of the top 64 of US Nationals. So there was a huge sort of amount of people playing this deck, which was kind of expected. And now we know Karen isn't legal. Night March is probably still going to be as good as it ever has been. Karen was the biggest sort of worry for Night March players, just because it kind of completely counters the deck and it makes it, well, virtually impossible to win. So now we know that Karen isn't on the radar, we can go back to thinking about whether Night March is what we want to play for Worlds. Regarding Steam Siege, there's a couple of cards that can really help Night March. The first is Pokemon Ranger. Obviously, this gets around things like Jolteon, which could be a huge issue for Night March, and then annoying things like Seismitoad and Giratina as well, with these annoying abilities and even more annoying attacks. Now you have a way around these attacks as well, which means that Night March sort of struggles to find something that can really hard counter it, especially with Pokemon Ranger stopping all effective attacks as well. And then we've also got Special Charge, another nice item letting you get 2 special energy from your discard and shuffling them into your deck. The biggest issue regarding this, obviously that's a hugely powerful effect and it keeps recycling on DCEs, which is basically how Night March wins. The biggest issue is that, is one space, because Night March lists are pretty clunky at the moment. There's not much sort of room for movement in them. And also, compared to something like Puzzle of Time, which puts 2 cards back into your hand, whilst Puzzle of Time could be a little bit more difficult to get the second effect off of, it's so much nicer getting 2 cards into your hand rather than shuffling 2 energy into your deck, because it means you don't have to then worry about digging through your deck to try and find these energy and still potentially whiffing the knockout. So it's another good card. Whether it will be played and whether it's the card for the optimal Night March list is something that is probably going to be tested quite heavily over the next few weeks. But yeah, there's definitely room for it in the deck if that's the way you want to go, rather than running some of these more risky, like whether you're able to get the 2 Puzzle of Time at once or things like that. You may see it more reliable to just use a special charge. It's going to be down to, I think, personal preference quite a lot, as well as what the optimal list actually is when it comes to Worlds.
Absolutely, yeah. It's weird to think that the current best deck in format, it loses nothing. In fact, it gains Pokemon Ranger, which is so huge for the card, for the whole deck, really. It really helps out some of the biggest bogey decks for it. They're based on attacks and the effects of attacks. Now you pretty much can only win if you beat them in a prize race, and that's why Night March is so powerful. Like, you need to be a non-EX deck that can take multiple prizes just to keep up with a Night March and go ahead of them at some point, unless you're chaining Lysanders, and even then, it's questionable to see whether you can do that and keep streaming attackers as effectively as the Night March players can do. Obviously, they're able to Lysander as well quite frequently. They play Target Whistle. There's even Captivating Pokepuff that they could consider playing as well as a one-of, maybe for mirror matches. And this is a big point we need to think about for Worlds. Night March is huge. We know that Night March is going to be big for Worlds. It's a safe pick. It's very, very strong. But really, the builds are going to be the interesting points here. There's maybe 2, 3, up to 4 slots, I think, are the ones where you can be most creative. Obviously, Special Charge is one you can think of. So far, when me and Jack have sat down to look at lists, it's been a sort of either-or. Either we play Special Charge and we don't play Puzzle, or we play Puzzle and no Special Charge. We've never had both in the same list. We feel that's a little bit overkill. But having no Puzzle in, it's a little bit weaker. You're very reliant on this one Special Charge sometimes if you are up against the non-EX decks. But it does sort of put the emphasis more on Lysandering and stuff like that. Not necessarily a bad thing, because Night March can oftentimes run through games with just the 4 double colorless energy alone. But that does offer up some spaces. It can give you some mirror match techs. Stuff like Pokemon Catcher has been used. Parallel City has been used sometimes. Captivating Pokebuff could be a great card to be thrown in, because again, you're forcing Shaymin EXs onto the bench when your opponent clearly doesn't want them there. So these are some sorts of considerations that we have to take in. Also, you can see the Vespiquen. It did win US Nationals with the Vespiquen being included in the deck, but Pokemon Ranger does really fill the role that Vespiquen used to do. It got around the Jolteon, and it also got around Seismitoad EX. Well, Ranger does that in one nice, neat package that's only 1 slot. So players may be going back to a more straight build, maybe having a Mew as a nice free retreat pivot. That was another thing that Vespiquen could do for you. I mean, you do lose your type advantage. You're very focused on getting Ranger, but I think overall it's just the better option right now. It's going to be interesting to see how people do end up developing their Night March lists going into Worlds. So next up we have Trevenant BREAK, and it's a pretty solemn slide. Nothing really changes with Trevenant. Just the fear of that Shaymin EX if people get their hands on them and people actually decide to play them. But for right now, Trevenant isn't a bad pick at all. It got 2 of the top 8 slots at US Nationals. It's clearly a strong deck, very consistent. We know Forest Curse is disruptive enough to win games off its own back. Silent Fear is great damage. It's been hailed as having quite a good Night March matchup, thanks to just having Bursting Balloons in combination with Turn 1 Item Lock that can sometimes just win you games. So it's clearly an option, a big contender. There's nothing really new that challenges it from Steam Siege. Like we say, just that Shaymin, if people are going to be playing it in the first place. And even then, like, there's been counters out there before. There's Lysander, there's Hexmaniac, but it's down to the opponent to actually draw into these cards under Item Lock. Sometimes you can have the perfect build that has a great matchup against Trevenant, but just Trevenant wins because Item Lock does things and means that you can't draw very well. How many times have we seen Trevenant players overcome dark decks just for those facts alone? It's going to be interesting again to see where people go in this direction, if it's going to be a heavy hammer build with flare grunts and such, or you're just going to go for pure consistency, maybe with a high battle compressor count and just go all in for the Wally, or you have a bit of both, a bit of a mix-up, have one or two headringers in here, combine it with like one flare grunt, but still remain as simple as possible. There's also, of course, red card builds. There's so many ways you can go with Trevenant, but the core is always the same, and that core is very strong.
Okay, so moving into the third deck, we have indeed got Aquabox. Aquabox is it sort of appeared out of nowhere, and then started doing really well all over the place. I think and it's kind of comprised with these three main Pokemon we've got here: Seismitoad, Glaceon, and Regice. There will be the odd Articuno around and things like that, but we've put these three on mainly because Pokemon Ranger can be quite disruptive to all three of these Pokemon. Obviously, Glaceon disrupting Evolution Pokemon, Regice disrupting EX Pokemon. Both of those effects are completely ignored with Pokemon Ranger, which makes the Aquabox matchup or the Aquabox deck a little bit weaker. It's likely that even though Toad is also disrupted by the Ranger sort of setup, it's likely that Aquabox decks are going to go more towards or to a more heavy Seismitoad list, just because it's difficult to be able to chain Rangers even if you get one turn of items, it can still be difficult to chain them. So it's likely to go back more towards a Seismitoad heavy Aquabox, I think. Obviously, Glaceon and Regice can still put in work in their respective matchups. And like we said with some of these other decks, especially Trevenant, if they don't draw into their Ranger, then Aquabox doesn't really lose anything. Aquabox is still as disruptive as it can be. It can still it can win matches without a doubt. It's purely based on whether they can draw into their Pokemon Ranger. However, Pokemon Ranger does deal quite well with a lot of the attackers within the Aquabox deck, meaning that it's definitely something to be aware of if kind of Aquabox was where you were first thinking, just because it can definitely sort of stop you in your tracks a little bit, and it's another sort of hill for the Aquabox deck to climb to be able to, I think, reach the top tables at the moment.
Yeah, I really think it's always going to be a risk to say, oh, this deck is completely dead now, Ranger stomps it. It's true that it really hurts a few of the cards, but Seismitoad EX wasn't always focused on Quaking Punch. Yes, it was, an early game option for the deck, but it is more focused on the Grenade Hammer at the end of the day. It just has to be more aggressive now. Maybe we are going back to putting in something like Aurora CX as a one-of, taking out these sort of stally, wally type Pokemon, the Glaceon, the Regice, try and get around with type advantage or type coverage, I guess, in other means. Maybe not just having straight water energy. Maybe we splash out in other directions. But there's still the core of Manaphy and Seismitoad, along with a really high Rough Seas count, which is still very strong for a whole bunch of matchups. You are a bit more shaky against the Night March. You're just hoping and praying that they don't hit Rangers. But if they don't, you can still win. So there's still that option. Articuno can still race you ahead sometimes as well and keep up in the race. So I don't think all is lost for this deck. It's going to be one that has to adapt a whole bunch, and it might be interesting to see if people, back it and are still confident enough in the deck with a slightly adapted build, and to see if it can make a splash in Worlds. So next up we have Darkrai Dragons. We saw it did well. It managed to get into the top 4 at US Nationals. Very strong deck. Again, it's one of these Max Elixir style builds with heavy EX Pokemon, utilizing Fighting Fury Belt and big attacks. The Dark Pulse is the main one that we look for with Darkrai. Powered up, and in the background we're putting Double Dragons onto Giratina EX, trying to get that Chaos Wheel going. The biggest issue for the deck is, again, Pokemon Ranger. This is going to be like something like Hex Maniac, where it's going to feature as a one-of in a bunch of decks, and it really does throw a curveball into the mix. So although it does gain Ninja Boy, which seems like a nice option, you can go from an early Darkrai into a late game or a mid game Giratina and completely switch up your strategy. Really put your opponent, off guard and really catch them in certain situations that are really cool for you. There is still the Renegade possibility, which is handy for a few mega decks. Not that there's many that we're discussing today, but it's still a nice thing. You just want to have these options. They're just inherently powerful cards, and it's always a good thing to just have a powerful deck. It might be one of these things where Darkrai does sort of develop to being sort of retreating back into its roots, where it's having no more dragons in the build, just having more non-EXs, some baby Yveltals, some Fright Knights, maybe a Yveltal EX for some type coverage, instead of going with the Giratina, because Ranger could prove too annoying for that card, just gets over Chaos Wheel too conveniently. But then you have to worry about Night March a little bit. Other than that, though, it still hits pretty hard, and it can still have answers, of course. So it's going to be interesting again to see how it does. It's weird that we keep saying the same thing. We just have to wait and see type thing that we keep bringing up. But really, this is our initial impressions. We've not sat down and done 20 games with every single deck so far, so we're interested to see in the results, to be honest, right now. But it's going to be, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see if they can do well. I'm still backing the deck. I still think there's plenty of potential here. I think for Worlds, I think it's more safe to have Garbodor back involved in the build because, again, the format is... I don't think it's necessarily as wide as it was for US Nats, but there's definitely surprises that can come out. Definitely on day one, people are looking to play rogues, people are looking to catch people off guard and break the meta. So Garbodor is one of these cards that really puts a stop to that. These wacky one-offs, these wacky techs, you just don't have to worry about them when Garbodor's around. It really just does cast a net over plenty of different things that you counter just because you have Garbodor. You didn't even expect to counter this card, but you end up doing so. So I feel like this is still a pretty strong pick for Worlds.
Okay, so next up we've got Seismitoad Giratina. We've just talked about both Seismitoad and Giratina and how they're kind of weak to Ranger, and that's kind of the inherent problem of Seismitoad Giratina. It's weak to Ranger. That being said, other than that, it's not really affected too much by Steam Siege. And again, if you can get this lock off with Seismitoad or Giratina and stop your opponent from being able to consistently get Rangers back, because they've got to invest VS Seekers into Rangers to be able to consistently stop them being item locked, which means they're not using any of the supporters as well. So it's definitely a difficult thing for a player to do, to be able to stop this sort of anti-lock that they're doing. But it is definitely something to consider with the when thinking about Seismitoad Giratina. It obviously did really well at US Nationals, coming second, and like we said when we were back on the slide showing the final standings, I think it took a lot of people by surprise how well it did. So it's definitely not a deck to be underestimated, but as with a couple of the other decks that we've mentioned, Ranger can stop the deck dead for a turn, meaning that your opponent will have items again and can carry on how they want to be playing, and that can lead into multiple turns of them being able to Ranger. In some cases, it's not like they'll never be able to do it. It's just it can still be difficult. That being said, I think Toadina is still it's quite a safe deck. I think, knowing that you know how to play the deck, it's not an overly difficult sort of deck to play. I don't think. I think it's a relatively a nice deck to pick because it's not overly complicated or anything.
Yeah, that's true. I think the Ranger is a bit of a pain, for certain matchups where you're still going to be favored. I think even if you do get Rangered once or twice, think about stuff like Trevenant, where they can be hexed or Lysandered once or twice and they can still pull out games. I think it will be the same in a lot of matchups, but I think Night March is the crucial one where it's not okay to get Rangered. You're always on a real tightrope in that matchup. You can drop sometimes 4 prizes before you've taken your first one, and you're just hoping that Quaking Punch plus N wins you the game, because hopefully they don't have outs at that point. But now that they do have an out that they can get at any time, it's a real tightrope for you. So against everything else, I think the deck can survive Ranger because it's more than just item lock. It's item lock, it's a bunch of hammers, it's a bunch of disruption cards. The whole deck is disruptive. You can... even if they do hit the Ranger off for a turn, they can only do a few things. They can only switch out of their dude and hit you back for a small amount of damage. You can still, get your Super Scoop up, get going again. It does gain Ninja Boy as well, so you can go straight from Quaking Punch into Chaos Wheel out of nowhere, which is worth noting. So it gains and it loses. I think the biggest issue is Ranger is so important for Night March. The deck is just crazy to worry about. And Seismitoad was once hailed as, a great option for dealing with the Night March, and I'm not sure if it is anymore, and that's the biggest question mark that we have to think about when testing. So, onto Mega Manectric. This was sort of a modest deck. It's never had the most success for a little while now, but it's sort of filled some nice roles. It did really well at Canadian Nationals, let's not forget. That Turbo Bolt is still very strong, but the sort of, again, you have to keep going back to, whenever I'm thinking about playtesting for Worlds right now, my first thought and my first mindset is, how do I beat Night March? Can I beat Night March? Because, I'm going into day one of Worlds, okay? I'm expecting if I can't beat Night March at least 50% of the time, that's, a bare minimum. Like, you're probably not going to get through. You're not going to have less than 2 losses if you can't beat Night March at least half the time, because you have to expect to play a few of these. So I think now with Ranger, once again, unfortunately, this one card is a real headache because Mega Manectric's only options for dealing with Night March has been Giratina EX to try and get a Chaos Wheel going or get Flash Ray going and hoping that these walls do enough throughout the game. Against other matchups, Mega Manectric's still fine, but you have to get through the first mental hurdle, which is, how do I beat Night March? And at the moment, I don't think Manectric can do that. It hasn't got the right tools anymore because Ranger is a one-card answer to everything that you can splash into your deck.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is one of the, along with Seismitoad Giratina, this is one of the biggest instances that Ranger is really harmful when it comes to a specific matchup. Like, Mega Manectric always struggled with Night March, but as soon as Jolteon was released, and people started clocking onto the Giratina, people became competent with the Night March matchup, and it was a winnable matchup. But I think the fact that this one card was printed shows how frail even that winnable matchup was. You were relying so much on things like Jolteon and Giratina, and as soon as they're gone, I think Mega Manectric really goes back to being really difficult matchup when it comes to when you're playing against Night March. So I think this is a deck that really kind of shows how strong this one card can be. Pokemon Ranger is a pretty insane card when it comes to a deck such as Night March, which is just as insane. I think that it's a really strong combination. I think, like I say, this is one of the decks where it's most evident. On to Vespiquen Vileplume, and again, it's a pretty barren slide simply because it doesn't really gain much and it doesn't really lose much. It's just kind of sitting pretty where it was. Obviously, it was in a format that Night March is going to do well in. There's going to be lots of non-EX decks that try and counter Night March, and that's where Vespiquen Vileplume wants to be. It wants to be dealing with things like that, rather than huge HP EXs that it can sometimes struggle to continually knock out, things like that. I think Vespiquen Vileplume, like we said with Trevenant, it's sitting pretty where it is simply because Steam Siege doesn't really shake it up too much. As long as you hit the right matchups with a Vespiquen Vileplume deck, nothing really much changes regarding the deck too much, I don't think. I think it's still very good, and obviously it won UK Nationals as well. The format was very different, but I think the fact that it can win a Nationals simply sort of shows how good the deck can be.
Absolutely. And I think I'm really glad that you brought up the point of UK Nationals where it did really well. And basically the expected format for UK Nationals was Night March was going to be big. There's also going to be a lot of Greninja. That's kind of what I'm thinking for Worlds right now because Greninja's a natural, it's got a fairly okay matchup against Night March. So having decent matchups against those two, you're much happier against non-EXs in general, like you were saying. And, the non-EXs are the best sorts of decks that can keep up with Night March. So Vespiquen is much better at hitting the lower numbers. It doesn't have to stress out so much. You get into your Vileplume and win games that way quite often. And it just sort of came out of nowhere for UK Nationals after not seeing too much play here. And, it just took down the tournament very convincingly, to be fair. And I could see it doing very well at day one of Worlds. It's one of these decks where I think it'll do, if it does well day one, it won't do well day two, because the people who go into day two now have Vespiquen Vileplume in mind. They can make their techs, make their changes to have a slightly better matchup. But going into day one, it looks like a real good pick for me. And if you're a competent Vespiquen Vileplume player, if you have plenty of solitaire hands, put yourself through scenarios, this could be the deck for day one to get you through on a relatively good record. But you have to be prepared, I think, to switch up your deck on day two, or at least switch up one or two cards to help you out with the day two things that people will tech for. If this deck does well day one, you bet your bottom dollar that people are going to tech for it day two because it's such an inherently powerful deck. But at the same time, it's very YOLO. It has just 4 double colorless in the deck. It's very beatable. It normally only gets up 1 or 2 Vespiquen and hopes to win that way. So if you can get over the initial 1 or the initial 2, you just win the game flat out. So it's not unbeatable, but I think it's a very strong day one pick for me. On to Zygarde Carbink, and this did surprisingly well on the tier list for me at least. I was never really hyping Zygarde Carbink for US Nationals. I'm still not hyping it now for Worlds. I can see a little bit more why it did well at US Nationals because there's a lot more EXs around in the format. There was, a lot more EXs, and I think that A few things that were weak to fighting. There was Darkrai being hyped, as too was Mega Manectric after the Canadian results. So Zygarde seemed to be a better meta call for US Nationals. I can see why it did okay there. For Worlds, like me and Jack have kept repeating, we're imagining it going a lot more in the direction of non-EXs, a lot more non-EXs to contend with. So therefore, Safeguard becomes a lot less useful. Zygarde's weakness to grass is still a pain because there's going to be Vespiquens floating around the place, and there's also potentially Yanmega, which we have a question mark over whether or not it's going to be good enough. Both of these things, hit for weakness, can do really well against Zygarde. So those are things to worry about. I really think it's not the best pick for Worlds, but again, I've not really seen the lists that have done well for US Nationals. Maybe there's something I'm missing. At the moment, I'm just not inspired by this deck.
Moving on to the other angle of Vespiquen, we have, of course, got Vespiquen and other stuff. And this is kind of a bit of a jumble of what you can put in a Vespiquen deck, simply because Vespiquen is a very meta-based deck. If you can build a Vespiquen deck that can counter the meta that you're expecting, so in this case, if you can build a Vespiquen deck that you can counter, that you can use to counter the world's meta, you could do really, really well. But obviously the task in that is working out what the world's meta is going to be and being confident enough to be able to pilot a deck that really relies on seeing the correct matchups all day and not kind of expecting or seeing anything you're not expecting. There's 9 different Pokemon on here that you can put into a Vespiquen deck. There's loads of different angles you can take it, and there's even some new contenders from Steam Siege as well. We've got Hawlucha, Volcanion, and Yanmega here, all of them kind of providing something a little bit different for the deck, which I think Vespiquen is naturally a really, really creative choice, and I think if you can really pinpoint the format, I can see it doing really well. I think the biggest concern for me is the fact that we're going into a tournament with literally no results to go off of regarding Steam Siege. Meaning that I think a lot of people may play it safe, which may mean Vespiquen is a decent pick, but a lot of people may be trying some new wacky techs from Steam Siege, and things that Vespiquen just isn't expecting, and therefore may be unable to deal with as competently as it can with things like Night March if you build an anti-Night March Vespiquen deck, things like that. I think that's the biggest issue for me, us going into a tournament that is we're going a little bit into the unknown, and that scares me a little bit when thinking about a Vespiquen deck, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm one of the people who really gets behind Vespiquen style decks when the meta's right. But like you're saying, Jack, you have to be super confident that you know what matchups you're going to face, and you're going to hit enough of those to, take a loss here or there if you do come up with something unexpected. But for the most part, you can have easy rides just playing matchups that you expect. And it could even be time for Crobat to be sneaking back into the format. It's been a while that it has been good, but I remember earlier on in the season I did well with my crazy Yveltal Vespiquen Bats deck. I don't really see much reason why it couldn't do well right now in this meta. It does quite well against a lot of the big decks. The amount of Pokemon is the biggest question mark. How crazy do you go? Do you go really high on the Pokemon count and then potentially have clunk issues? But that gives you the option to hit the higher numbers against any sort of deck in general. Or do you skimp out, go to like 25 Pokemon? That gives you more consistency, which is obviously a very important factor in something like Worlds where you have to play a lot of games. But it means you lose the raw firepower for just punching out other decks that you're not expecting. So really, it's a huge meta call in general to play this deck, but also putting the right number in terms of Pokemon, the right split between your items and your Pokemon. This is going to be the defining factor if you do well with this deck or not. How techy do you go? Do you go balls to the walls and say, I'm going to have a low Pokemon count and be as consistent as possible, try and win my games because I expect this matchup, and this matchup? Or are you going to go, I want a huge amount of Pokemon in here so I can take on pretty much anything, but at the same time accept that sometimes your deck is just going to draw bad hands because you're playing, a ridiculous amount of Pokemon. So it's one of these gambles that you have to come up with and see if it will work for you. So next up we have Vileplume Zygarde. This is, the sort of coward's option if you still want to play the Vileplume style deck, but you're not quite all in enough to play the Vespiquen Vileplume build, you play it with Zygarde, potentially even Carbink. It's not quite as fast as the Vespiquen Vileplume because you're going a lot less YOLO. You don't necessarily need to hit the Vileplume turn 1. It's not quite as consistent as the Vespi Vile builds, but you eventually get this item locked down. You pair it with a high HP EX Pokemon, which can do a fair chunk of damage every now and again, and hope that just winning exchanges with a high AZ count as well. You have healing, because that 190 is a high barrier to get through. You have Carbink, which can recycle energy as well. Item lock plus safeguard is a really annoying thing for a lot of decks to get over. So you just have options in the deck. But again, it's the slower build of Vespi Vile. And I think the deck is so pure, so correct when it's Vespiquen Vileplume. I wouldn't really want to stray away from that build personally. But people have had success with this build, so you can't really knock it.
Okay, next up we've got Medicham Carbink. Again, this has seen some success over the past couple of weeks. Obviously, we've got Safeguard kind of blocking opponents' EXs, which is a really, really nice ability. If you're expecting an EX-heavy format, we kind of are, but I think, as we've been mentioning all the way through the video, we're kind of expecting more of a non-EX format, so Safeguard may not be as useful as you'd ideally like it to be. But Medicham itself can deal with non-EX formats. It can do really well against Night March, which is obviously a key point to think about when going into a tournament where I think Night March is going to be one of the highest expected decks. Being able to kind of trade 2 for 1 with one Medicham against 2 Night Marchers potentially, and then having Focus Sashes as well, meaning that one Medicham can do really, really well against up to potentially 4 Night Marches. They can't deal with Focus Sash and a single Medicham before it gets into the active position, doing a lot of damage. I think it's a risky play, simply because I don't know. I think it's not as consistent as it would like to be, and I think that's why it hasn't been as popular as some of these other decks that we've talked about before. It can deal with Night March, and I think that in itself is a selling point for the deck, because Night March, like we've been saying, is going to be popular, and if you can't deal with Night March on day 1, you're running the risk of not even getting to day 2 just because of how many Night March you're expecting to see around the field. But I think the deck has some things going for it, but I think it's a risky play. I think it's a very risky play, in all fairness, just because I think it can run into consistency issues regarding other matchups as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think consistency issues are a worry for this deck. Also, item lock is a huge worry. Obviously, Trevenant is pretty grim. I mean, you do have Calm Mind that you can spam, but as soon as they get going with Tree Slam, you're pretty much out of the game. So I think it's got as many good matchups as it has bad. So again, it's one of these things where in the US Nats meta, it seemed a little bit better to pick, but for Worlds, I think it's a lot less appealing. On to Yveltal Zoroark now. It's not really performed as well as I would have expected. It's one of these decks that's pretty high on my list in terms of decks that I would consider for Worlds. It has, enough good quality non-EXs. Baby Yveltal has been one of my favorite cards all season. Friday Night also does offer quite a bit right now. Shutting off tools, so good for the likes of these big EX decks that love using Fury Belt. Obviously, it's annoying for Megas and all sorts, to be honest. Having that dark typing is helpful against Trevenant, and if you have enough non-EXs in the deck, you can try and keep up with the likes of Night March. Zoroark's Mind Jack attack, it could be potentially complemented with the likes of Captivating Pokepuff, which we do gain in the format, thanks to Steam Siege. Not sure if it's going to be a cheeky one-of. Maybe you just prefer having Whistle. Maybe you go for a high count, have like 2 of these in the deck, and really just go YOLO. You get some info on your opponent's hand, which can help you out if you're trying to N or judge them, as well as, sometimes forcing EX Pokemon onto the bench, if you're lucky, to increase your output and give you easier Lysander options. We do, of course, still have Ninja Boy, which could lead to us wanting to have Yveltal EX back into the list. Go for some early Oblivion Wings, switch up into Yveltal EX, and straight away you're doing big numbers. It's one of these trade-offs. If you do have Yveltal EX in the deck, such a powerful card, good against the EX matchups. but it's a liability against the likes of Night March. So one of these things where you have to consider how good it's going to be. Another real worry for this deck, I actually played it at a league challenge not too long ago, and the biggest hiccup for me was the Aquabox deck. If the Aquabox players are playing smart with their bench, obviously Pokepuff can ruin those sorts of things if you're lucky, but if they're playing smart, they can really limit your output overall and just heal off enough to where they just out damage you throughout the game. They hit good numbers. Grenade Hammer deals with the non-EX Yveltals very cleanly. Also deals with Zoroark Break if they have a Fury Belt on, which most of the time they will. So it's really awkward for the deck. Also, Greninja's not too favorable either for the similar reasons. They have Rough Seas, they can free retreat around so much that they're forcing so many resources out of you all at once. Sure, you can foul play and stop them using their abilities quite often, but really you're not getting much progress yourself because they're healing off for the majority of the time. So getting the build right is going to be the most interesting thing for this deck. If it can be built well, I think it can succeed because it ticks a couple of early boxes that it can handle Night March relatively decently with enough non-EXs. And also it has the type advantage over Trevenant, which obviously isn't everything, but it's a good start against that matchup at the very least. So something to bear in mind. It does have equal amount of threats, really. It's like we were saying with the Medicham, maybe a bit less extreme than Medicham, but it has good ones and it has bad ones. So you really need to get the balance right if you're going to succeed with this deck.
Yeah, I think Yveltal Zoroark is in quite a good place right now. It's quite versatile. Obviously, things like captivating Pokebuff can be quite cute for the deck, helping out with Zoroark, things like that. I think going into Worlds, it's definitely one to think about at least. Okay, so next up we've got Greninja, a deck that wasn't too popular at US Nationals, didn't do particularly well, but the metagame was very different. And going into Worlds, I think we're going to have a metagame that's quite similar to UK Nationals. At UK Nationals, Greninja Break was one of the most popular decks. It was everywhere. It was doing well. So I think it's potentially Greninja's time to shine again. It likes Night March. It has a competent Night March. It can quite easily win the matchup, and it definitely is able to navigate other matchups with relative success. It has a couple of iffy matchups. But the deck in itself is relatively consistent, especially now lists have been sort of optimized. I think at the start of Greninja's career it was kind of inconsistent and no one really knew the best way of playing it, but now we've had 8-9 weeks of people playing this deck. Lists are pretty much optimized. Obviously Ranger can stop things like Shadow Stitching, but that's not a huge issue. It's not like that was what the deck relied on. It will always be more scared of Hex than Ranger. Ranger is just another thing to sort of think about going into the Worlds format, because there may be a turn where where you're not able to get through or get by using Shadow Stitching, things like that. But it's not a huge issue at all. It's just something to keep in mind really when thinking about what other players can do against your Greninja deck.
Yeah, I think, like you're saying, I mean, look at how it performed. It did worse than Medicham Carbink. And I mean, I'm not trying to insult that deck, but you'd really expect Greninja to be higher based on its earlier performances. And, you know, it's one of these things where if people sleep on it, because it did so poorly at US Nats, it can do well. If people are, they respect Greninja for what it is, its abilities are very good. If you let it run riot, it will run riot. And, if you just run into enough Night March matchups, if there are other people playing these non-EX decks, you can do quite well. Those snipes are big for lower evolutions, as well as being great against the EX decks. Having those Rough Seas can help out against Trevenant, even though it's clearly not the nicest of matchups for you at all. So get the build right once again. This is the key. You've got to have answers for the Giratina, for the Garbodor if people are picking up and playing with it. But I expect it to be a lot less prevalent, just because people want to have, consistency for at least day one, in my opinion. Consistency is the main word of the day for day one. You just have to make sure your deck performs well in every occasion, no matter what you're up against. So, have the consistency there, which means people may not be playing Garb, at least on day one, which could be great for Greninja. That being said, though, if people are respecting Greninja as they should do, it could still run into problems. So it's one of these tightropes where Greninja can sometimes just turn up and win events, but sometimes there are enough people trying to counter and still think about Greninja despite its poor performance. That's the key. It's done poorly, but people still keep it in mind. It's whether or not people do that enough at Worlds to see if this will thrive. So, on to one potential contender as an actual, Pokemon-based deck from Steam Siege. We've really just been talking about the importance of items, and we really think that is the main effect that they're going to have for Worlds, at least until post-rotation, where we can start seeing these decks really come out and do well. But for now, there's the question mark over Volcanion, whether or not this can do well. We've seen a few fire decks pop up here and there, thanks to Blacksmith, thanks to just raw aggression. Some of these cards like Entei, obviously Entei Zard popped up for a small while. Entei Zard was actually a good deck against Night March, so potentially with enough non-EXs, if you're just playing baby Volcanions and a high Entei count, you could do quite well in those sorts of matchups, which would be great to see. But I also think that EX shouldn't be, you shouldn't really sleep on this guy because the Steam Up ability, makes you hit for amazing numbers. Volcanic Heat isn't a shabby attack when you think you could get it on turn 1 as well. It hits for water and fire, so there's a few weaknesses that you're covering as well, which is pretty cool for you. The non-EX Volcanion, I don't know if it needs to be fit just in a Volcanion build on its own. Just having that acceleration, if you have colorless attackers, that Excel is absurd. It's double non-EX Yveltal, and non-EX Yveltal has been one of the best cards we've had in format for a long, long time right now. So this Volcanion clearly has a lot going for it. There were some good fire-type attackers out there. If you want to play Malamar and Flareon, there is that option. The deck had been, murmuring around, not really the top tables for long, but it sort of poked its head up, and every now and again, that deck has had results. So maybe with these new introductions, the non-EX Volcanion, I have to stress, is so amazing. And Volcanion EX as well improves your numbers, which, that's always going to help you out. So if you get this right, I think with enough non-EXs, if you don't go as greedy as possible, not with like the Hooper, the 3 or 4 Volcanion, a lot of Shaman, that's how you're going to do badly with this deck. I think you have to reel it back in, have maybe one Volcanion EX, have a lot of non-EX Volcanion, a lot of the Entei, and that way you're going to be a pain for a lot of different decks.
Yeah, I think so. And I think another thing is, I think Volcanion will be a deck that people will think about, but they'll be so focused on making sure they've got Night March sorted and Trevenant sorted, they may decide, okay, I don't have time to test something like Volcanion. So it could also be a bit of a hiccup for your opponents just because they're not 100% sure how to deal with the matchup. And I think that's definitely something you shouldn't underestimate when going into a tournament as well. So I think Volcanion is definitely potentially a sleeper, and I think it's a really, really cool deck at least, no matter what, with a lot of options, especially when you think about things like Entei and Baby Volcanion as well. Okay, so the other Pokemon-based deck coming out of Steam Siege is indeed Yanmega. Yanmega's ability basically means that if you have 4 cards in hand, your attacks are free, and his attack does 50 plus 70 more if your opponent has a tool on them. So you can see immediately why we've got the head ringer there. If you face an EX, you're going to be doing 120, potentially turn 1. When you think about we have Forest of Giant Plants, Grass type is such a strong type still, even when the format... Grass type will always be a strong type while Forest of Giant Plants is in format. So Yanmega definitely has that going for it. Free attacks, if you can get your hand size to 4, is fantastic. It's not quite as versatile as the old Yanmega Prime's ability, which is a little bit sad. But it is definitely a really, really nice ability. And again, like I said with Volcanion, I think a lot of people will kind of skimp out on testing this guy just because they will want to be focusing purely on dealing with these expected matchups like Night March and Trevenant, things like that. So this may be another deck that you can kind of sneak into Worlds with and take people by surprise, be able to hit good numbers, hit strong numbers really early, and not really... Well, people won't be expecting the deck at all, I don't think. Not in any such way that they're going to have tested a lot for this matchup. So I think you could really, really surprise people with going into the tournament with the Yanmega deck.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting one. I think it could be seen as, how we see Vespiquen right now, in that you play Vespi with other things. I feel like Yanmega has to be paired with some sort of other attackers, because otherwise you can be shut down by Garbodor, you can be shut down by Hex, Chain. All these things could be a pain. So I think this guy's going to be more of either a split with other attackers, like we currently see with Vespiquen, or we see him as like a 2-2, just for type coverage and every now and again getting a cheeky bit of damage in there for free while you're stacking up energy on other attackers onto the bench. Just having plenty of threats on the board all at once, you have nice free retreat. Basically what we're saying is this card has a lot of good things going for it. We don't necessarily know where it's going to fit in right now, but if you've got time to test Yanmega, definitely test Yanmega because there's so many traits there that make you want to really like the card. Again, I never really think as a front stage kind of guy, but potentially with the right text and the right support behind you, this guy could really take people by surprise, like Jack was saying, and hits good numbers and trades quite nicely, has that flexibility. It ticks a lot of boxes, and basically that's what we're trying to cover here. So the final deck we want to talk about is METALBOX, and METALBOX really wasn't represented enough as well, I think, for US Nationals. Not sure if it's the case that it wasn't played enough, or maybe it just wasn't succeeding enough. I'd be surprised if it was the latter, because again, we saw some interesting decks do well at US Nationals, but really there's still a lot going for the METALBOX deck. It gains a few things, doesn't really lose much. It does gain Ninja Boy, which is nice because everything in the deck is pretty chunky. And it also gains this Carbalion, which although it's just a non-EX with a revenge style attack, I think because it's a cheap attack, just 2 metal, means it can be a real nice late game finisher. And I think the deck does sort of need this, especially because it's just the 2 energy. It means you're a lot less weak to Hex. You can still get that huge burst of damage right at the end of the game, even if people are trying to lock you out of it with Hex Maniacs. You can still get manual attachment, and you're pretty much going if you have other energy already in play. So with these 2 cards, the deck does gain enough, I think, to really be considered all over again. The deck was already fairly high tier. I think the biggest issue was because people were playing Garbodor at US Nationals, a lot more people were playing Megaphone, and the deck is very tool-centric. It needs Fury Belts, it needs a lot of Float Stones. Ninja Boy does alleviate Float Stone a little bit, although you're still going to play high numbers, of course. Obviously, it's an issue that Fury Belt is still going to be knocked off quite a few times, so you do have to be concerned about these things. But there's still a lot of good things for the Metal deck. Genesec's a huge attacker, because you can hit that 100 is a great baseline for the non-EXs, and obviously against the EX decks, you can choose to discard to hit the nice numbers there. Bronzong Break is your get out of jail free card against the Night Marchers, as long as they can't Hex Chain you. But most of the time they are able to do that. We do, of course, have Max Elixir to fall back on. I think going back up to a 4 count is probably the correct thing to do for Worlds, because you have to expect people to be on their A game, hexing at the right times, and as often as possible, pretty much. So having the split between Metal Links and these Max Elixirs, you pretty much, you're a lot less vulnerable to these sorts of things. You cover your bases in 2 different places, which is really nice. So if you have enough non-EXs, like I say, the Carbalion, even if it's a one-of, it can swing games a lot of the time because it can come in and take 2 and be 1 prize for the opponent. So that's pretty important. And yeah, just having that low cost can finish out games when your opponent may not expect it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the other thing with METALBOX is it's relative. It can deal with a lot of situations. I think versatile is probably not the right word, but it can deal with a lot of different situations presented to it. So I think going into a tournament like that, knowing your deck can do that is definitely a really, really useful trait. But yeah, that was METALBOX, and yeah, that was pretty much they're the top few decks that I think we're all kind of expecting to see to an extent. Or at least based on the US Nationals and the Charizard Lounge's power rankings, we can see how Steam Siege is going to affect these decks, and how going into this Worlds format where we haven't had any previous tournaments with Steam Siege to sort of fall back on, how we, at least on first impressions, are kind of seeing the format shape. Obviously, it may not be perfect, but I think it would be incredibly difficult to perfect the format or accurately predict the format based on the fact that we won't have any tournaments with Steam Siege before we even go into Worlds. So I think we've covered a lot of bases here, a lot of different decks, and this hopefully will be a good sort of place for you to go back and check whether you're able to deal with these different matchups competently, things like that, when thinking about going into Worlds.
Absolutely. I just hope that this is a nice prompt. We've been asking questions, we've been throwing the questions out there. These are the questions that you guys have to consider when thinking about your deck for Worlds and what other decks you want to test against. What decks are still surviving? What decks are really thriving? It's like what we were saying for the rotation video that I did just a week ago or so. It's pretty much that same sort of format of video. We at least attempted to do it in that way to see what decks are really high priority targets that you have to test against and have to consider as the top decks. But really, we're extending the question to you guys. You guys have to go out and do your testing. Obviously, I'm testing for myself, so in a selfish way, I don't want to reveal what I'm thinking so much as to the point where I'm making it obvious what I want to play, because, you know, having so many viewers, we have some sort of influence. That may be a big-headed statement, and it may sound pretty selfish, but, you know, we're starting to ask questions. It's still early for our testing. And that does lead into quite nicely the fact that we're going to be starting to do these Steam Siege deck videos as well. We're kind of torn between, do we want to come out with super fun, let's find Mega Gardevoir with lots of Fungus and make this list kind of fun, or do we want to go super serious, here's a Night March list with one new card, it's called Pokemon Ranger. But, you know, I think people want to see a mixture of both. I think people want to see brand new lists, and also they want to see the Worlds type list that we're looking at. So testing has begun for us, and we're going to be pretty soon getting a few of these Steam Siege videos out for you guys. So it's something to look forward to. But most importantly, if you did like this video, do leave a like. Comment on what you thought about the video, what sort of things, maybe we missed something, maybe there's a deck that we undersold, maybe there's something that we, you know, completely isn't on our radar at all that needs to be considered. We'd love to hear you. Get down in the discussion below. And subscribe if you haven't already. If you did enjoy this video, there's plenty more on the channel to check out. So I think from myself and Jack, that pretty much wraps up everything.
It does indeed. We have got a plan in place regarding Steam Siege, we do promise. But yeah, other than that, thank you very much for watching. I've been Jack with Joe from Omnipoke. Look out for Worlds videos and some more fun Steam Siege videos. I'm not going to Worlds, so I'll be trying to keep the fun Steam Siege videos coming as well. So it's not all going to be focusing purely on Worlds, but then after Worlds is done, we're going to be heading straight into a new format, so that's always exciting. But yeah, other than that, thank you very much for watching. I've been Jack with Joe from Omnipoke, and we look forward to seeing you in another video.